Nam. My name is Maya Callahan. I'm 29 years old and I've been married to my husband Daniel for 4 years. I want to tell you about what happened at our Thanksgiving dinner last November because I still think about it almost every day. Not because it was the worst night of my life, although it came pretty close, but because of how it ended, and because of what I found out about the person I thought I knew. Before I get into it, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Heartway Stories, and drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from. Okay, let me tell you everything. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's wedding when I was 25. He was standing near the dessert table looking slightly lost, and I made a joke about the fondant flowers on the cake being a fire hazard. He laughed. We talked for 3 hours. 6 months later, we were officially together, and 2 years after that, we got married in a small outdoor ceremony in Vermont with about 40 people and a borrowed arch covered in real dahlias. I loved our life. We lived in a 2-bedroom house in a suburb outside Columbus. Daniel worked in logistics management. I worked as a project coordinator for a small nonprofit that helped place foster kids in stable housing. We weren't rich. We weren't struggling. We were just building something, quietly and steadily, the way you're supposed to. The only complicated part of our life was Daniel's older brother, Marcus. Marcus was 41, single, and had worked as the general manager of their family's landscaping company since their father stepped back 3 years ago. He had always been the one the family turned to, the one who handled things. And for a long time, I think he saw Daniel as the younger brother who needed looking after, even after Daniel was fully grown, married, and doing just fine on his own. When Daniel and I got together, Marcus was polite to me. Perfectly polite. But there was always something underneath it. A slight hesitation when he asked about my work. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes when I mentioned our weekend plans. Once, early on, I overheard him tell their mother that he hoped Daniel wasn't rushing into things. I was in the next room. I don't think he knew I could hear him. Over the years, the comments became a pattern. Small things. Nothing you could point to directly. He'd mention offhand that Daniel used to date someone who worked in finance, like that was a relevant piece of information for no reason. He'd make little remarks at family dinners about how it was so nice that I had a job I was passionate about, with just enough emphasis on the word passionate to imply it wasn't a job that paid well, which, to be fair, it didn't. But the way he said it always felt like a verdict. Daniel noticed sometimes. I could tell by the way he'd reach over and squeeze my hand under the table. But he never said anything directly. Marcus was his brother. They'd grown up together. I understood it. I really did. Some battles aren't worth the fallout. So I stayed quiet. For 4 years, I stayed quiet. And then came Thanksgiving. It was a big gathering that year. Daniel's parents had recently upgraded to a larger house out in Powell, and this was the first major holiday in the new place. There were maybe 20 people coming, aunts, cousins, neighbors, family friends. Daniel's mom, Patricia, had been planning the menu since October. I'd offered to bring 2 pies and a green bean casserole, and she'd seemed genuinely grateful. The day started fine. We arrived around noon to help set up. I spent the first hour in the kitchen with Patricia and her sister arranging dishes and making small talk about nothing in particular. Daniel was outside helping his dad move some extra folding chairs from the garage. The house smelled like rosemary and butter and warmth. Marcus arrived around 2 in the afternoon with a bottle of wine and a look on his face I didn't recognize at first. It was the same look he usually had. Calm, composed, the kind of expression that says, I know something you don't. But there was something extra behind it that day, something almost eager, like he'd been looking forward to this. I told myself I was imagining it. I should have trusted my instincts. Everything was fine through the appetizers, fine through the first hour of mingling, fine while people settled into seats and Daniel's dad said grace and everyone passed the turkey around the long table his parents had rented specifically for the occasion. Then, around the time dessert was being cleared, Marcus stood up. He clinked his glass lightly with a spoon, the way people do at weddings when they want everyone's attention. The room got quiet. People smiled, expecting a toast. He said he wanted to say something before the evening ended, that he'd been sitting on this for a while and it didn't feel right to stay silent any longer. I felt Daniel go still beside me. Marcus looked around the table slowly, and then he looked directly at me. He said he'd recently discovered some things about the family business account. Some financial irregularities. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. And then he said the irregularities seemed to trace back to Maya. The room did not explode. It went very, very quiet, which was somehow worse. Someone said, "Excuse me." Someone else set their fork down. Daniel turned to look at me, and I could see the conflict in his face. Not accusation exactly, but confusion. The kind that happens when something makes no sense and your brain is still trying to catch up. I felt my whole body go cold. And then, a few seconds later, I felt something else. Because 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving dinner, something strange had happened at work. I'd been helping process some small grant disbursements, standard paperwork, when our office administrator flagged an error on one of my submitted forms. She said a bank routing number had been changed. I told her I hadn't changed it. She showed me the form with my digital signature on it. I was completely confused. I had not submitted that form, or at least not that version of it. I spent 2 days quietly trying to figure out what had happened, and during that time, I also noticed something else. My shared login credentials for the family expense portal, the one Daniel and I both had access to for tracking our joint finances, which was also linked loosely to the family business because Daniel's father had set it up years ago through the same software. Those credentials had been accessed from a device I didn't recognize. I mentioned it to Daniel that evening. He thought it was probably just a glitch. I wasn't so sure. I reached out to a friend of mine, a woman named Carrie who worked in IT security and occasionally helped people with exactly this kind of thing. I asked her to look into it as a favor. She got back to me about 10 days later with something that stopped me cold. Standing in that room, surrounded by Daniel's family and extended relatives and people who had known Marcus for decades, I made a decision. I did not panic. I looked at Marcus and asked him, very calmly, what exactly he had found. He said there were transfers. Money that had moved through accounts connected to the business that shouldn't have moved. His tone was measured, almost sorrowful, like he hated being the one to bring this up. He even shook his head a little, regretfully. Very convincing. Daniel's mother had gone pale at the other end of the table. His father was gripping his glass without drinking from it. A cousin I'd only met twice was staring at me openly. Marcus continued. He said he understood this was uncomfortable, but the family had a right to know. He placed a printed document on the table and slid it toward Daniel's father. He said these were account records showing the discrepancies. Daniel reached across me and picked up the paper. His eyes moved over it quickly, and I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. He said my name quietly, like a question. I put my hand on his arm. Not defensively, I just kept it there. I said, "Marcus, can I ask where you got those records?" He said he had access to the accounts. He was the general manager. It was his responsibility. I nodded slowly. I said that made sense. And then I said, "Would you mind if I pulled something up on my phone?" He looked at me for a second. Then he smiled slightly, the way someone smiles when they think you're about to embarrass yourself, and said, "Of course." I took my phone out of my bag. My hands were steady. I want to be honest. I had never been so aware of my own heartbeat in my life, but I had made a decision 3 days earlier about how I was going to handle this if it happened in public. Because by that point, I was fairly certain something was going to happen in public. I just hadn't known when. I opened the file Carrie had sent me. It was saved in my email, PDF format, time-stamped and formatted on the letterhead of the security firm she consulted for. I pulled it up and set the phone in the center of the table so that Daniel's father, who was sitting closest, could read it without me having to say anything. He leaned forward, read for a moment, then looked up at me. He asked what this was. I said it was a login access report for the family expense portal, the one Marcus had used to pull the account records he'd just shared with everyone. Marcus said he didn't see what that had to do with anything. I said it showed every device that had accessed the portal in the last 60 days, including the device that had accessed my personal credentials. The table was so quiet I could hear someone's chair creak. Daniel's father turned the phone slightly and looked at the screen again. Then he looked at his oldest son. Marcus's face had gone very still. Daniel took the phone from his father and read it himself. He read it twice. Then he looked at Marcus and said, "This says your home IP address." Marcus said that was impossible. Daniel said the document showed Marcus's home IP address logging into the portal under my credentials 9 days ago. Marcus pushed back from the table slightly, just an inch or two, and said that someone must have spoofed it. He said anyone could fake an IP address. He said I had clearly put this together to deflect. And normally, that might have worked. It's a confusing enough technical claim that most people at a dinner table would hesitate. Would think, well, maybe. Would decide they didn't know enough to judge. But I had expected that too. I reached into my bag again. I had a manila folder. I placed it on the table and slid it toward Daniel's father the same way Marcus had slid his printed records. Inside were 2 things. The first was a copy of the amended form from my workplace, the one with my forged digital signature, along with a time-stamped email from my office administrator flagging the error, dated 3 weeks prior. It showed the routing number had been changed to redirect a grant disbursement. The account it had been redirected to was not mine. The second was a bank statement. The account the money had been redirected to had been opened 6 months ago. The name on the account was a business entity called MT Property Solutions, LLC. A quick search, which Carrie had also done for me, showed the registered agent for that LLC was Marcus Callahan. Daniel's father opened the folder, read the first page, and didn't speak for a very long time. When he finally looked up, he wasn't looking at me. Marcus had started to say something. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said he could explain. He said he had intended to put the money back, that it was a short-term borrowing situation, that the business had been under pressure and he hadn't wanted to worry anyone. He used the word borrowing. I think that was the word that broke something in Daniel's father's face. Daniel's mother stood up quietly and walked out of the dining room. I heard her footsteps go down the hall. A door closed softly. Marcus looked around the table. Most people were looking at the tablecloth or their hands or somewhere neutral, the way people do when they are watching something private fall apart and don't know where to put their eyes. A few of the cousins had started whispering. His aunt was staring at him with an expression I can only describe as grief. Daniel stood up. He was calm in the way that means the opposite of calm. He said he wanted Marcus to leave. Marcus said, "You're going to take her word over mine?" Daniel said, "I'm looking at documents from a registered security firm, from a bank, and from your name on an LLC. This isn't about anyone's word." Marcus looked at me one more time. I don't know what he was hoping to see. Maybe that I'd feel bad. Maybe that I'd soften. I just looked back at him evenly and waited. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He walked to the front door without saying goodbye to anyone. And then he was gone. For about 30 seconds after the door closed, nobody said anything. Then Daniel's uncle, who had been sitting at the far end of the table the entire time and had not said a single word through any of it, cleared his throat and said very quietly, "I think Patricia made that sweet potato pie from scratch this year." Someone laughed. Then 2 people laughed. And then the room sort of breathed again. Not fully. Not normally. But enough. Daniel sat back down next to me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he put his hand over mine on the table and just held it there. His father closed the folder and set it down. He looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Maya. I'm sorry you felt you had to walk in here prepared for that." I told him it was okay. It wasn't entirely, but it was the right thing to say in that moment, and I meant it enough. The rest of the evening was quieter than it should have been for Thanksgiving. Some people left earlier than planned. Others stayed and tried their best to make the conversation feel normal again, talking about the football game, about someone's kids starting college next fall, about whether the new downtown restaurant was actually worth the wait. Daniel and I didn't really talk until we were in the car driving home. He sat in the passenger seat. I drove because he needed a minute, and he stared out the window at the dark road for a long time. Then he said, "How long did you know?" I told him about the login alert, about calling Carrie, about the 2 weeks of quietly collecting information while sitting across from him at breakfast, and not saying anything because I wasn't certain yet, and because I needed to be certain before I said a word. He asked why I hadn't told him when I found out. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said that Marcus was his brother, that if I'd come to him with a theory, or with half a picture, it would have put him in an impossible position. I needed to have the whole thing in hand before I asked Daniel to look at it, because once I showed him, he couldn't unsee it. He was quiet for another mile. Then he said, "That must have been a very long 2 weeks." I said it really was. He reached over and put his hand on my arm, and we drove the rest of the way home without talking much. Not in a bad way. In the way of two people who have just been through something and are still processing the shape of it. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Daniel's father filed a formal report with their accountant and then with a business attorney. The attorney confirmed that the total amount that had been misappropriated from the family business was just over $60,000, transferred over approximately 14 months in increments small enough not to trigger automatic flags. Marcus hired his own attorney. As of the time I'm recording this, the matter is still being handled through legal channels. Daniel's father has not spoken publicly about it, neither has Daniel. I have thought a lot about why Marcus did what he did that night. Standing up at that table, making that announcement, trying to redirect everyone's attention toward me at the exact moment he must have known I was getting close to the truth. I think he believed I was the easiest target in the room. I was the outsider. The one who had no history with this family before I showed up. The one whose loyalty would always be questioned before his was. He probably thought that if he moved first, loudly and publicly and in front of people who had known him for 40 years, I wouldn't be believed even if I tried to respond. What he didn't account for was that I had stopped being passive a long time before that dinner. I'd been quiet because I chose to be. Because the comments weren't worth the conflict. Because I loved Daniel and I wanted our life together to be peaceful, and sometimes peace costs something. I paid that cost for 4 years. But there's a difference between choosing not to fight small battles and allowing someone to burn down everything you've built. I knew the difference, and when it mattered, I was ready. I don't tell this story to make Marcus look bad, although I understand that's an unavoidable outcome of telling the truth. I tell it because I want anyone watching this who is in a similar position, who feels like they are always the one being watched, always the one whose motives are questioned, always the one who has to prove themselves in rooms where everyone else already belongs. I want you to know that quiet preparation is not the same as weakness. Knowing when to wait is not the same as giving up. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be ready, and make sure you have everything saved as a PDF. I've thought about that Thanksgiving a lot since it happened. Not obsessively, but the way you return to something when you're trying to make sense of it. Turning it over slowly, like a stone you keep finding in your pocket. What Marcus did wasn't just an accusation, it was a calculation. He looked around that table and decided I was the weakest link in the room. The one with no history there, no deep roots, no decades of built-up goodwill to draw on. He figured that if he moved first and moved loudly, the weight of the room would do the rest. And honestly, he wasn't wrong about the math. He just didn't account for the preparation. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the dramatic moment when Daniel's father read the folder, not the look on Marcus's face when he realized it was over, but the 2 weeks before any of that. The quiet mornings where I sat with my coffee and thought carefully about what I actually knew, what I could prove, and what I still needed to find out. The evenings where I talked to Carrie and took notes and made sure everything was documented and saved and backed up in 3 places. That part wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even satisfying in the moment. It was just work. Careful, unglamorous, necessary work. I think there's something important in that. We tend to celebrate the moment of reversal. The point where the truth comes out, where the person who tried to hurt you is finally exposed. And I'd be lying if I said that moment at the table didn't feel like something. It did, but the moment only meant anything because of everything that came before it. The patience, the discipline of not reacting too early, the decision to stay calm when every instinct was telling me to defend myself immediately, loudly, emotionally. Marcus spent 14 months quietly moving money out of a business his father built. And then, when he sensed the walls closing in, he didn't stop or come clean. He pointed at me. That's what happens when someone has been getting away with things for a long time. They don't develop better judgment. They develop better deflection. And eventually, deflection requires a target. I was his target because I had always been the quieter one in that family. The one who let things go. And I don't regret that, exactly. Some things genuinely aren't worth the fight. But I learned something that year about the difference between choosing peace and disappearing into it. I had been so careful not to cause conflict that I had made myself easy to blame. That changes how I move through the world now. What I want anyone watching this to take from it is simple. Document things. Not because you're paranoid. Not because you should live in a state of constant suspicion. But because clarity is a form of protection. Knowing what actually happened, being able to show what actually happened, that matters. It mattered more than anything I could have said in the heat of the moment. And if you're the person in the room who always gets watched a little more carefully, who always has to prove themselves a little harder, that's exhausting and it's unfair, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But that scrutiny, as unfair as it is, can also make you sharper, more careful, more prepared. Marcus had 41 years of being trusted in that family. I had 4 years of being an outsider. And in the end, the outsider had the folder.